First of all, just a very brief overview about Beaufort. Beaufort Capital was formed in 2013. We specifically provide mezzanine finance for property development all across Great Britain, any real estate asset class, and typically looking at GDVs of 20 million and above. The thrust of today is to talk about, as Steve's kindly sort of set the scene, what's happening in the regions. And we've assembled a panel who hopefully will be able to tease out some of the issues with which we've faced. We're going to have a sort of half-hour session now. I'm going to ask for some questions at the end, and then we'll go back through for tea and coffee and the like. So I'll just introduce the panel if I may. On my right here is Melanie Leech. She's CBE, joined the British Property Federation's Chief Executive Officer in 2015. Melanie has held a number of senior governmental roles, including at the Department for Culture, Media and Sports and in the Cabinet Office. Her role is to champion UK real estate and to promote a sustainable partnership between government and the sector to deliver a high-quality built environment. Next is Brian Welsh, CEO of the Nido Collection, one of Europe's leading providers of purpose-built student accommodation. Prior to joining Nido, Brian was Chief Operating Officer of 360 Developments until the sale of the business in 2017. Whilst there, the company developed or acquired and then subsequently disposed of more than 20,000 student, build-to-rent and multi-family beds. Next along is Clive Wilding, Property Director at Artisan Real Estate Investors, and that specialises in mixed-use schemes in UK cities, focusing on hospitality development, residential, office and placemaking retail. Artisan was awarded the Scottish Property Company of the Year in 2018. There's two significant schemes under construction in Glasgow and Edinburgh, which Beaufort is delighted to be supporting. And finally, last but not least, Richard Eames is an Executive Director at CBRE, the world's largest commercial real estate services firm. He's an RICS registered valuer with more than 25 years' experience of valuation advisory services to the commercial banking and corporate sectors. Richard is Head of Valuation for CBRE's national team, which is a multi-location team of 50 staff all throughout the UK. So, we're going to kick off, Richard, if we may, in your role across the whole of the UK, and what do you see in terms of an overview from a yield perspective for different sort of asset classes?
Thank you, Mark. I think from our point of view, what we're seeing at the moment, from our point of view at the moment, what we're seeing is still quite a lot of yield compression, which some people might take as being quite a negative thing. From our point of view, I think, just looking at it in the context of today's subject, what we're seeing from an investor point of view is people increasingly viewing the regions as providing good value for money. So yield compression is one thing, but actually the wider question is what's the yield spread across the market and where are we compared to London, and increasingly where are we around the world. So if we look at the traditional investor base across the UK regions, it would have been local property companies, private individuals and maybe the odd fund. Okay, but if they had a particular penchant for that area because they went to university, that sort of thing. What we're increasingly seeing is at the top end of the market, particularly in sort of like brand new offices in central business districts, the main purchasers are the UK real estate funds, as you might imagine, but actually increasingly sort of foreign investors, particularly from the Middle East, Far East, Canada, North America, those sorts of areas. So what does that mean in terms of yields? Traditional sort of CBD, so heartlands of Bristol where I work, Birmingham, Manchester, that sort of thing, you're looking at city centre offices now probably 4.75%. That sounds quite scary if you're like me and you've worked in the regional market for quite a long time, until you suddenly pick up on what Steve said about central London, and then when you look at Munich at 3.5%. Okay, so investors are saying, well, I can buy a building, let's KPMG. It's got 15 years on the lease, it's a shiny building. So in terms of hard investment, what's it got? Identical building construction, identical lease structure, the same tenant. But it's 4.75%, not 3.5%. So it's a massive difference in terms of yield returns. The secondary office market is picking up on that, and there's a lot of rental growth in the secondary office markets, principally for two things. Number one, a lack of stock in Grade A, and the second one is the alternative uses, so students and sort of conversion to residential, which has basically dried up that secondary market. So there's an awful lot of rental growth, which has compressed yields further. Industrial is everybody's darling of the market at the moment, has been. It's been outperforming offices for some years now, which is quite incredible, and rental growth is there. So it's not as though people are just buying yields on weights of cash. They are buying it with real rental growth opportunities. So you are seeing rent starting to be £7, £8, £9 a square foot in regional markets. And there's some good opportunities there. So still plenty of industrial estates which are at £5, £6 a square foot, plenty of demand, and of course, fantastic tenant mix from a risk point of view. Retail's a slightly more thorny subject. You know, we all can read the press, and you know, there's a lot of CVAs and a lot of trouble on the high street, and it would be wrong to say that there aren't going to be structural voids in regional high streets. They're going to be. There's just not going to be enough shops to fill those up. That said, I think if you pick the right towns, the right locations, and importantly the right retailers, then things are good. There are plenty of success stories. If you look at Primark, for example, 100% cash owned, no debt, and they buy all their properties freehold. How can they not be a success story? So yields are a lot more challenging there in the retail market, and in truth are probably drifting out a little bit at the moment. So in terms of the sort of like headlines, that's sort of where we see things at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you for that very helpful overview, Richard. Melanie, in terms of you, what do you feel about the elected regional mayors, and what are they doing to help really get investment out into the regions?
Well, it's quite early days, but I think they're already making their impact. And what's really interesting, I think, about the devolution program is actually the Act is very enabling. So the opportunity is absolutely there, and I think the deals that have been done, you know, they hit all Steve's buttons really. You know, they're around the levers that you need, how you drive economic activity, transport, skills, housing and planning. You know, it's not surprising they're all pretty similar, because those are the levers that local leaders need to pull if they're going to create economic wealth and go towards that social inequality that Steve was talking about. So far so good, I think. They vary obviously in terms of scale, and that slightly, I think, reflects the maturity of the different regions and how far they'd already managed to drive their own agendas. I think Andy Street's been sort of quite clear around, you know, kind of earned autonomy, if you like. You know, take what you've got, show that you can do something with it, and you hope that government then will be prepared to let more go and devolve more locally. And I think that's a good thing. And I think, you know, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, nor would I personally at least want to. So I think we're on a journey, and I think it's very much up to those local mayors to make it work, and to show that it works, and to earn the right, you know, to take more back, because the more they can take from the centre, I think, the more they'll be able to drive their local economy to be suited to local needs. Just picking up on the investment point, I think what's really interesting is we spend a lot of time talking to the mayors on the one hand, and they've got their very clear visions about what they want to do. We also spend a lot of time working with the Department for International Trade, talking to potential investors. And one of the things I think that the framework of devolution has the opportunity to do is to unlock the mismatch that sometimes exists between the fact that, you know, a lot of these systems are very local, and a lot of these projects are very local and quite small scale to a global investor, whereas they're looking for scale opportunities to invest. So you've got this £100 million barrier where, you know, a lot of the projects are below that, but a lot of the investors say, well, we don't want to look at anything below 100 million. We want scale. So how do you kind of create enough scale and enough vision? Because they also want vision. They don't just want to invest their money. They want to invest in a proposition that excites them. That's not just about building stuff, but it's about the connectivity. It's about what you're doing for people's lives. It's about creating communities. So I think, you know, that's the opportunity and the challenge, is to sort of bring those things together.
And that's actually a lovely segue into my question to Clive. Clive, Scotland has clearly been a good area for investment for Artisan. But what characteristics are you seeking from a placemaking perspective to really make a difference?
I think in many of the cities where, you know, further north where we've been very active, is really, you know, the strength of the regional mayors, and I think a very clear, consistent vision that they share with the council leader. And part of that, it is about connectivity, absolutely, transport. And it's interesting how those cities have died in the centre and spread out to the suburbs, and now it's about coming back near the railway station. And half that requires completely changing the place, and investment through government initiatives such as City Deal, where it's used to invest heavily in public realm. I think Sheffield is a classic example of that. Right at a time when it couldn't afford it, it invested heavily. Bob Kerslake, who was chief executive, and took a very brave decision to invest heavily in public realm. It made a huge difference. It made a huge place where parents were visiting universities with their children. It suddenly felt like a safe place. It suddenly felt like a great square. And where the universities are growing in those cities around that place as well, make a great contribution as well. Glasgow's just secured a 1.2 billion City Deal fund to improve its streets in the city itself, the public realm, making it a pleasant place for visitors from overseas cities to visit at the weekend, not the traditional Glasgow street you would have seen back in the 80s. Edinburgh has just won a City Deal to extend the tram system into somewhere more attractive than just the airport, into the residential area. So it's a strong regional vision that joins up with the leader of the council that managed this great success is that long continuity between leader and chief executive, but also actually that investment in public realm, making the city a lovely place to be at day and night. Cities are 7-day, 24-hour places.
Absolutely, and it's clear for all to see, but thank you very much for that, Clive. Brian, a couple of people have touched on student accommodation just in their responses, but when people think of student accommodation, they often think Oxford, Cambridge, and Steve mentioned Oxbridge earlier, and Russell Group, Red Brick Universities and so on, but when you're looking at investment across the UK, presumably you look a little bit further afield than just that.
Well, that's absolutely right, Mark. I mean, as Steve said, education is one of the key drivers of the UK economy at the moment, and in terms of geographical diversity outside of London, I actually started investing in purpose-built student accommodation in Newcastle and in the territories initially back 30, 40, 15 years ago, when the sector was very, very embryonic. But people often talk about Oxford and Cambridge, and they talk about Russell Group universities. And surprisingly, some of those things that seem intuitive just aren't. So in Oxford and Cambridge, actually, you think, let's invest in student accommodation in Oxford and Cambridge, and when you get there and you start trying to let rooms, you realise that everybody in Oxford and Cambridge wants to live in college, not in purpose-built student accommodation. So what you're in fact doing is you're investing in 2 secondary universities, and Andy Ruskin University, in one example. And that's if you saw that university on its own in a town with very high land prices, I'm not convinced you would be going there and developing purpose-built student accommodation. Now, if you look at a city with 2 universities, like let's take Newcastle as an example. Newcastle University, a very strong red brick, Russell Group University, and Northumbria University, a former polytechnic. Actually, all of the growth in the past 10 years has come at Northumbria University and not Newcastle. So one might contend that in an extremely negative downturn, the red bricks will be more financially secure than possibly the new universities. But actually, in terms of the growth, that's kind of not been the case. And I think this year has been the toughest year to date for purpose-built student accommodation occupancy because of additional supply coming online and the lag effect of people investing in purpose-built student accommodation. But actually, this year we're in a perfect storm of the smallest number of 18-year-olds ever, the real demographic dip, which will continue for about another 18 months or so, and then we're out the side of that. That's had no meaningful effect on university applications. In fact, there's the biggest amount of supply coming to the market this year than ever before, which had a marginal effect. And we've had the increased competition amongst universities for the first time ever, so we've seen more aggression in clearing from universities. Previously, if you had an offer of 4 A's to study a particular course at a particular university, and you got 2 A's and 2 B's, then you needn't bother calling them because they're not going to have you. Now, actually, they're calling you saying, don't worry about those 2 that you missed out, why don't you just come anyway? And if you had an offer of 3 B's at a mid-tier university, you get better universities contacting you now saying, you know what, I know you applied for Manchester Met, you can actually get Manchester University for the same course in those grades. So this year we're seeing real change in the sector, which is going to take a year or so to wash out. But in general, the principles are very, very strong.
Melanie, I know it's not your sort of role to try and defend what's happening in the planning side of things, but I'm just conscious that for all of these good things to happen, we need the planners to be on board. And I just, it's a source of constant irritation to our clients, property developers saying, they'd love to do X, Y, and Z, but they just can't. Would you like to comment from your perspective?
I think the real issue is resourcing. Local authority planning resourcing has been stripped out and stripped out and stripped out. And that's just as much of a problem for the private sector as it is for them, because you lose the quantity and the capacity, but you also lose the skills. And actually that's at two levels. I mean, that's the skills and the capacity to deal with the throughput of planning applications, but that's also, and critically I think, you lose the vision of planning, you lose the people who can have the ability to, and the time to stand back and really be what planners ought to be, which is absolutely contributing and central to creating the vision of place for an area. That's the first thing that goes when you've got 50 planning applications sitting on your desk and 50 developers screaming at you for answers. So we see the resourcing of planning both at the strategic level and at the operational level as an absolutely critical issue that collectively we have to find a way of solving. And we've consistently said that developers will be prepared to pay more for a guaranteed level of service. Now that's quite challenging in all sorts of obvious ways because, I'm an ex-public servant, so I'm just as acutely aware of the difficult position that both elected local politicians and elected local officers are under in terms of accountability. And I want, it has to be transparent and it has to be clear that developers aren't just being able to pay for the decisions that they want. So how do you find a way of putting more resource in that deals with those accountability concerns? That's one of the things we've been talking to MHCLG about, and it's one of the things that we've made a proposal to government under the industrial strategy for a sector deal for real estate, and it's one of the things that we talk about in there. How do we find a way through that? Because we have to, I think, otherwise the system's going to stay clogged up and we're not going to have that strategic support that the mayors and other elected leaders need in order to deliver what they want to deliver.
I mean, it continues to be a hot potato. I know it was mentioned at the Labour Party conference yesterday, but it's something that obviously we all need to resolve as best we can. Clive, just going on to hotels, if you may. Recent figures released show that regional hotels have far outstripped London hotels in 4 of the past 5 years. What's your thinking, and how do you see that from an Artisan perspective?
I think we've really witnessed that in the regions, the cities, because public realms coming together, connectivity's coming together, it's also actually a pleasant place to go for a weekend. So actually, and I think because of the exchange rate, I think the city break is really here to stay. And I think actually the regional cities are a lot easier to cover a few square miles than a daunting place such as London, and half the price. So I think actually it's easy to jump on a flight from Rotterdam to Glasgow as it is to come into London, half the cost. So that's one thing I think for the weekends. I think the other thing is also very much a little bit what Steve was saying. It's interesting, the decision for Barclays to form 2,500 new jobs in Glasgow very recently. And what that means, I travel the country, those planes are filling up now. And it's filling up from those executives that are working in London, in the office in Holborn Street, now travelling up to Glasgow and having to stay in the hotels 2 or 3 days there rather than coming down to Reading where the former HQ was. So there's a shift in the corporate week rates with central management going to where the workplace is. And I think it's also actually the city break. You can get a good weekend in Glasgow for £250.
Sounds good, competitive. Brian, widening the discussion now to co-living and multifamily developments and so on, what additional considerations are there? When you look at your student side, I appreciate you're looking for university towns and cities, but when you take it to a wider sort of remit, what do you look for there?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So at the Nido collection, we're also investing in co-living, which is kind of, I guess some people have described it as student accommodation for grown-ups. So it's a similar sort of concept where you forego a little bit of your internal room area for some more shared common space. And we think it's very attractive to millennials. It's very attractive to people who want a greater sense of community, and we think it's very accretive. You can get a higher density on a particular plot and perhaps make it more viable. But you have to be very careful. These are very specific, location specific. We think in general with co-living it's very much a city centre product. We think good transport links are essential. We think people are less likely to drive cars. We like areas with a lot of millennials, relatively high wages, relatively high graduate retention rates. So quite often you're in a similar a similar environment to student accommodation. We think for sure we know there's a massive macro trend towards increasing urbanisation and this trend towards community shared space. We think supports that agenda very strongly. What we have real difficulty with at the moment is planners understanding it, HMRC understanding it. So all of the systems of government who desperately require additional accommodation on a finite piece of land, desperately require people to walk to work, cycle to work. All of this is all accretive to that, but they in the same breath, they're unwilling to engage in sensible conversations around this higher density housing stock. So I think there's a bit of body of work to be done. I'm sure Melanie started that process, and we'll honestly that in due course, around having more of this co-living product. And for us actually wider, because we're expanding into Europe, we've got opportunities in Berlin and all over the place where we think the macro really supports the conversation, but this conversation we then need to mirror in a bunch of different European countries, which in various languages, post-Brexit.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, those conversations are ongoing, and I think there's a real challenge to the tension is, that space standards, so how big the spaces that you're living in has been totally conflated with the quality of what you're living in. So I think there's still a huge education job to be done to showcase the quality of what's on offer, even perhaps in a different way, and to change perceptions of what that really means. Because I think there's a huge perception still of what that all that means is you're cramming more people in, and therefore automatically the quality of their accommodation, the quality of their experience will be low. And just as we're on a journey with build to rent in terms of changing mindsets around what renting should be like, I think there's equally that education journey to be done around some of the sort of compact living, co-living spaces and things like that. I think it's a mindset and a cultural thing.
And of course, runs into Sill, runs into affordable, runs into everything else. So together, we've got a couple of good sites in London. We know that from a site into a co-living development. It's anybody's guess how long it's going to take.
Indeed. Richard, I'm conscious that everybody's been bigging up the regions, all good stuff. Obviously, that's the main thrust of today. But at the same time, there are hot spots out there which you probably think a little bit too frothy now. Where would you sort of perhaps steer clear of at the present time?
It's always good to end the note with a value or talk of the market. Never knowingly overvalue, the John Lewis motto here. I think you've got to be a bit careful about saying where's the market hot and where's the market not. And if I can answer the question by turning it on its head, I think where I would be looking at is where things have clearly happened an awful lot of, if somebody's spotted a good idea, don't be the first in, maybe be the second in, don't be the fifth in, is probably the best way to be. So there are certain cities across the country where you can see an awful lot more activity, and depending on the sector that you're in. We already have seen foreign investment going into Birmingham and Manchester, for example. So, it may be that there are certain pockets there where you can see opportunity. But then if you sort of look at the sort of hierarchy of regional cities, and then you look at, say, Leeds or Birmingham, Cardiff or Glasgow and Edinburgh, as just been mentioned by Clive, you can see that these cities have very much got their acts together and are probably in that next phase ready to go, sort of thing, or if not already going. And so the only note of caution I would give is it's very easy in the property industry, we get all self-consumed with property and rents and yields and take-up stats and all that sort of stuff. But we've got to remember that the bulk of property is basically an envelope for a process. And that process is either because you live there or because you work there. And so the cities that enable living and working through all the things that we've all discussed this morning can only be the ones that succeed. And so cities that don't offer those things, jobs, infrastructure, education, retention of student talent, those sorts of things, are going to be the ones where I would avoid. So I think you don't want to be, if you're the 10th in line on a really good idea, probably you want to sort of say, is this the one for me? But equally, if you're in an area where you haven't got a proactive local authority, there isn't infrastructure going in, there isn't a good buzz about it, you haven't got, you take examples, take Southampton, who'd have thought it, little old Southampton. Okay, and in a recent survey, it's just come out actually above Cambridge for the tech sector. I mean, who'd have thought it? It's Southampton. Yeah, it's bound by France and London, isn't it? So, and yeah, there it is out of Warwick, yeah. You look at Bristol with the media and so on and so forth, really popular. Look at Channel 4, look at BBC in Cardiff, look at material science in Birmingham, and look at life sciences in Manchester. There's a lot of other stuff going on, not just big investments in banks. So to me, I would play gap analysis. That would be my take.